Well, hello again, my dear. Come in, sit close, and dry off your shoulders. The rain's tapping on the roof like it wants to sing you a lullaby. Grandpa's got another story to share tonight, one that begins on the edge of a sleepy village nestled between green hills and winding cobbled lanes where time itself seemed to move a little slower than the rest of the world. At the very edge of this village, down a narrow path lined with old lanterns and whispering trees, there sat a tiny stone cottage with ivy crawling up its walls and wildflowers blooming defiantly from every crack and corner. But this wasn't any ordinary cottage. No, this was the home of an old clockmaker named Elliot Greaves, a quiet man with a soft voice, gentle hands, and eyes that always seemed to be studying something invisible, like he could see the gears turning behind the sky. Elliot had lived in that cottage for longer than anyone in the village could remember. He never hurried, never raised his voice, and never missed the ringing of the tower bell at noon. His workshop sat in the back of the house, cluttered with brass gears, tiny screws, ticking watches, and clocks of every shape and sound. Tall grandfather clocks lined the walls. Pocket watches hung from strings like wind chimes. And in the center of it all was a great wooden table, always covered in velvet cloth and illuminated by the soft, golden light of a single oil lamp. Children whispered stories about him, that he could fix time itself, that he'd once mended a clock so old it had forgotten how to count, or that he'd made a watch that could take you back to your favorite day if you wound it with a wish. But Elliot never confirmed or denied anything. He would just smile and return to his work, the soft tick-tick-ticking of his tools echoing like a heartbeat through the cottage. But on this particular day, the one our story begins with, something changed. The rain had come early, and the skies were darker than usual. Elliot stood at his workbench, polishing a small copper timepiece, when he heard a knock at the door. A knock so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, except it came again. When he opened the door, there stood a girl no older than 12, soaked to the bone, her boots muddy, and a leather pouch clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't speak at first. She just held out the pouch and said, "My mother's clock stopped ticking," and so did her smile. Elliot took the pouch gently, nodded once, and stepped aside to let her in. And in that moment, something in the cottage shifted. As though time itself had taken a deep breath, the girl's name was Clara, though she didn't offer it at first. Not because she was shy, but because the ache she carried seemed to weigh heavier than her own name. She sat near the fireplace, wrapped in an old wool blanket Elliot had laid across her shoulders, while rain whispered softly against the windows and shadows from the fire danced across the walls. The cottage smelled of wood polish, rain-damp stone, and something faintly sweet, perhaps cinnamon or chamomile tea. Elliot said little as he opened the leather pouch she had handed him. Inside was a small clock, square, silver-framed and delicate, with a single bluebird etched into the corner of its glass face. The second hand was stuck between moments, trembling ever so slightly but never moving forward, as though caught between memories. It was beautiful, even broken. Elliot held it to his ear, his fingers brushing over the carvings on the sides, and then looked up at Clara with those soft, time-worn eyes. "Tell me when it stopped," he said gently. Clara looked into the fire. 3 weeks ago," she whispered. "The same day my mother stopped singing." She wrapped the blanket tighter. It used to sit on her windowsill next to the garden. She said it kept the house happy. But ever since the last storm, it's just quiet. Her voice cracked a little then, and Elliot didn't press her further. Instead, he turned the clock over in his hands and opened its back. Inside, the gears were still, not rusted, not broken, but oddly reluctant. It was something Elliot recognized not from any book or training, but from the slow ticking of life itself. Some clocks stopped because of damage. Others stopped because they'd been forgotten. But this one had paused out of grief. Elliot said nothing. He simply rose, motioned to the girl to follow, and walked toward the back of the workshop where a tall glass cabinet stood. Inside were dozens of tiny wooden drawers, each labeled in looping script: moments, echoes, hope, stillness, first snow, last words. He opened the drawer labeled laughter, and from it he retrieved a single golden ear, small but shining like sunlight on water. Clara watched quietly, unsure if what she was seeing was real or the beginning of a dream. Elliot returned to the workbench, nestled the golden piece into the heart of the bluebird clock, and wound it gently. There was a soft click, and then the ticking returned, not loud, not fast, just steady. He handed it back to her without a word, and as she held it close, a tear slid down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't from sorrow. It was something softer, something healing. The clock ticked on, slow and true, as though time itself had forgiven the silence. Clara didn't want to leave that night, not because she was afraid or cold. The cottage had already warmed her completely, but because something inside her felt different. The moment the clock in her hands began to tick again, it was as if the silence she'd been carrying for weeks had cracked open just enough to let a little light in. Elliot didn't ask her to go, nor did he insist that she stay. Instead, he simply brewed a pot of peppermint tea, poured her a cup, and placed a soft cushion beside the hearth where the flames flickered like old stories being retold. As she sat, sipping slowly, her eyes wandered around the room. Every shelf held tiny wonders, glass jars of glinting screws, books with titles like Echoes in Metal and The Shape of Sound, and faded photographs of people she didn't know but felt she somehow recognized, as if they too had come here once, seeking repair. "What do you put in the clocks?" Clara finally asked, her voice as hushed as the wind brushing the window panes. Elliot glanced up from his workbench, where he was polishing the brass face of a pocket watch. "Memories," he said simply, then added with a wink, "and sometimes tea leaves or stardust, depending on the mood." She wasn't sure if he was joking, and she liked that. "Is that what you gave mine? A memory?" she asked, looking down at the bluebird clock resting in her lap. Elliot paused. "I gave it a memory of joy," he said. "Your mother's laughter lives in the corners of that clock. I could hear it when I opened the back. Grief had quieted it, but laughter has a long half-life. It lingers." Clara didn't respond right away. Instead, she curled closer to the fire, letting his words settle in like snowflakes on her shoulders. As the evening deepened, Elliot led her upstairs to a tiny guest room tucked beneath the eaves, with a slanted ceiling and a round window that looked out into the rainy woods. There was no electricity, only a single oil lamp casting a warm glow and a ticking clock in the wall that whispered time so softly it sounded like breathing. As Clara lay under the thick patchwork quilt, The bluebird clock nestled on the nightstand beside her. She listened to the steady rhythm of the cottage, the way the walls creaked like they were stretching after a long nap, the rain drumming gently on the roof, the faint chime of unseen clocks marking unknown hours. And with every tick, every whisper, every breath of that enchanted home, the knot inside her chest began to loosen. She didn't know then that this visit would change her life, that this quiet clockmaker and his ivy-covered cottage would become a compass in her world, guiding her not back in time, but gently forward toward something whole and beautiful and slow. That night, wrapped in warmth, Clara finally slept without dreams, just peace. Morning arrived the way a soft lullaby ends, slowly, gently, with light spilling through the round attic window in muted gold. The rain had paused, though the trees still dripped gently, their leaves heavy with last night's tears. Clara opened her eyes without the weight of sorrow pressing against her chest. It wasn't that the sadness was gone. No, grief lingers in quiet corners. But it had softened, as though the house itself had taken part of it and said, "Let me carry this for a while." She stretched beneath the thick quilt, her fingers grazing the little bluebird clock now perched faithfully on the bedside table. It was ticking, a quiet, rhythmic heart that seemed to pulse just for her. She smiled, not with joy exactly, but with recognition. Something old and important was returning, one tick at a time. Downstairs, Elliot was already at his workbench, polishing the brass dome of a peculiar clock shaped like a seashell. He greeted her with a warm nod and slid a plate of warm bread and honey toward the kitchen table without a word. Clara sat and ate slowly, taking in every detail. The soft crackle of the fireplace, the scent of lemon-wood polish, the way the cottage hummed, even in silence. "Do you fix all the clocks in the village?" she asked. Elliot shook his head. "Only the ones that matter," he said, setting the seashell clock gently aside. "Some clocks tell time, others remember it. My job is to know the difference." After breakfast, he took her to a room she hadn't seen before. It was a long hallway lined with clocks, wall clocks, mantel clocks, floor clocks, clocks shaped like birds, moons, cats, and teapots. Each one ticked in perfect rhythm, yet no two sounded the same. He led her to a tall mahogany case near the end and opened its glass door to reveal a clock that didn't tick at all. Its hands were frozen at midnight, and instead of numbers, the face displayed tiny painted symbols, an open book, a candle, a tree, a pair of clasped hands. Clara reached toward it, but Elliot gently touched her wrist. "This one is waiting," he whispered, "for someone who remembers a promise they once made." Clara tilted her head. "What kind of promise?" Elliot gave her a small smile. "The kind made from love, not obligation. Sometimes those are the only promises that make clocks like this start again." They stood in silence for a while, just listening to the rest of the hallway breathe in its chorus of quiet time-keeping. And somewhere in Clara's heart, an old door creaked open. She didn't know why, but she felt something stirring, a memory she hadn't yet recalled, calling softly from a distant corner of her spirit. Clara spent the afternoon wandering the cottage with the bluebird clock in her hands, holding it the way one holds a memory they're afraid to lose again. The storm clouds had returned by midday, but this time the rain felt less like sorrow and more like a soft lullaby whispered across rooftops. It was in that dreamy hush of weather that she found herself drawn to the old garden behind the cottage, a wild, tangled space that seemed more enchanted than tended. Flowers of every kind stretched lazily toward the gray sky, raindrops clinging to their petals like forgotten tears, and a winding stone path led from the back porch to a wrought iron bench nearly swallowed by ivy. Clara sat there for a long time, letting the ticking clock rest in her lap, while her eyes scanned the garden, searching not for something to see, but for something to feel. It came to her not all at once, but in fragments, like threads pulled gently from a dream. A song her mother used to hum when she tended her own garden. The soft way she'd brush dirt from her knees, then look toward the sun and say, "Time is patient, sweetheart. We must be too." Clara had forgotten that until now, forgotten how every spring her mother would say the garden didn't bloom because of effort alone. It bloomed because it was listened to. She remembered planting seeds beside her mother, pushing them into the soil with tiny fingers while her mother told her stories about fairies who lived beneath roots and bees who whispered the day's secrets to each flower. And suddenly, it made sense why the clock had stopped, not just because of whether or where, but because a piece of that joy, that rhythm of simple, shared moments, had been lost when her mother's laughter disappeared. Back inside, Elliot was stirring something in a small copper pot, a mixture of rosemary, honey, and lemon peel. "You remembered something," he said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. The garden, her song. It was like the clock. It ticked when she sang. I forgot how that felt. Elliot poured the mixture into a mug and placed it beside her. "You didn't forget," he said gently. "You just needed the right silence to hear it again." That night, the ticking of the bluebird clock filled the cottage like a second heartbeat, and Clara found herself humming that old garden tune just under her breath as she curled once more beneath the quilt in the guest room. The rain danced on the window like fingers tapping a piano, and the entire house seemed to sway with her rhythm, a house that held time like a storybook waiting to be read aloud again. The storm deepened that night, not with anger, but with a kind of fullness, as if the clouds had been waiting all day to finally pour their hearts out. Thunder rumbled softly in the distance, not loud enough to startle, just enough to remind the world that even the sky needs to sigh sometimes. Inside the cottage, everything glowed in candlelight. Elliot had lit tall beeswax candles in every corner, their flames flickering gently like old memories trying not to fade. Clara sat near the hearth, cradling a wool blanket and sipping the last of her rosemary tea, the bluebird clock ticking peacefully beside her. There was a stillness in the room, not empty, but rich, like the quiet before someone begins a very important sentence. That's when Elliot stood from his workbench and walked to the far side of the room, to a tall wooden cabinet Clara hadn't noticed before. It was covered in carvings, swirls, leaves, moons, and something that looked almost like stars falling into water. He opened the cabinet slowly, and from its depths pulled out a key, long, slender, made of something darker than brass but lighter than iron. Its bow was shaped like a small sun, and its teeth were crooked like it hadn't been used in a very long time. Without a word, Elliot handed it to Clara. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Third door on the left. It hasn't been opened in years, but I think it's time now." Clara's heart stirred. The weight of the key in her palm felt ancient and warm, like it remembered things she hadn't lived. She climbed the stairs slowly, the boards creaking beneath her with every step, as if each one unlocked something deeper inside her. The third door on the left was ordinary, plain wood, a little chipped at the edges. But the moment she slid the key into the lock, she felt it, that soft electric pause, like a breath caught between the inhale and the exhale. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dust, sunlight, and silence. And clocks, dozens of them, but not ticking. They were paused, mid-movement, their hands frozen at different times. Some had pictures where numbers should be. Others had no faces at all, just open spaces and turning wheels. In the center of the room sat a large round table, and at its center was a globe, not of Earth, but of stars, constellations etched in silver across a deep blue surface that shimmered in the candlelight. Clara stepped closer. On the wall behind the table was a single phrase carved in tiny cursive letters. Not all time passes. Some of it waits. And Clara understood then. This wasn't just a room. It was a memory chamber, a place where time slept until someone brave enough came along to wake it. The clocks in the room didn't tick, but the air still felt alive, charged with quiet electricity, like the moment before rain touches your skin. Clara stepped further inside, her fingers trailing gently across the still wooden faces, each one unique in shape and silence. Some were tall and solemn, others squat and whimsical, their designs etched with suns, moons, birds, and even musical notes. She began to notice something else, too. Each clock bore a tiny brass plaque at its base, and upon closer look, she saw names, first names only, and beside them, a single date. Leora, April 12th. Thomas, September 3rd. Eleanor, June 17th. The names meant nothing to her at first until she reached the small walnut clock near the globe. Its plaque read, Elliot, October 28th. Her breath caught. These weren't just clocks. They were memories. Frozen fragments of time, tethered to the people who had once needed them most. As she stood there, the room seemed to lean inward, not physically, but emotionally, the way a memory does when you're on the brink of remembering something important. She turned back to the globe at the center table, and hesitating only for a moment, gently placed her fingers upon its surface. It was smooth and cold, like stone dipped in starlight. The stars carved into it began to shimmer softly, one by one, like embers catching breath. Suddenly, the globe let out a quiet mechanical click, and a drawer beneath the table slid open. Inside lay a thin, leather-bound book titled The Forgotten Hours. Its cover had no other markings, but when Clara opened it, her own name was written on the very first page, followed by a blank line, as though the story had been waiting for her to arrive before it could begin. She flipped further and found pages filled with tiny, delicate handwriting. Each entry was a moment, some ordinary, some magical. A garden dance in the rain. The first time her mother taught her to braid lavender. The time they fixed a broken teacup together and called it the Mended Moon. These weren't entries she had written. These were memories she'd lived, recorded by someone or something that didn't want them lost. Elliot's words echoed in her mind. Not all time passes. Some of it waits. And now she understood. This room didn't just hold clocks. It held heartbeats, ones that had paused because someone needed time to heal. And the globe, it was a map of waiting moments, waiting for someone to return, open the book, and remember. Downstairs, the wind whispered through the garden, and the house groaned softly, like it was pleased with her discovery. Clara sat by the glowing globe for a long while, reading the moments aloud, each word a spell that gently wound her heart forward again. As the evening dimmed the skies and the rain tapped once more against the window, Clara realized something quietly powerful. Her grief had not erased her story. It had only slowed it, and now she was ready to let it begin again. That night, long after the candles had melted low and the storm settled into a gentle drizzle, Clara lay awake beneath the patchwork quilt, the book, The Forgotten Hours, resting on her chest like a warm heartbeat. Sleep had visited briefly, but her thoughts were too full of ticking silence and the strange, star-filled room above. She turned her head toward the window, where raindrops painted stories against the glass, and listened to the steady beat of her bluebird clock. But another sound lingered underneath it, a deeper, slower rhythm that pulsed through the floorboards like breath. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house groaning. It was something older, something alive. Clara rose quietly, carrying the book with her, and tiptoed down the stairs. Elliot wasn't in the workshop. The fireplace was nothing more than a faint glow of embers, but she could feel the warmth he left behind, the kind that doesn't come from flame, but from presence. She called his name gently, once, then twice, but there was no answer. Her eyes turned toward the grandfather clock near the door, tall and carved with suns and gears and storm clouds. It was ticking, yes, but its pendulum had stopped. She stepped closer, curious, and noticed that the glass panel at the bottom wasn't just a case. It was a door, and behind it there was a spiral staircase. She knelt, hesitated only a moment, then turned the small brass handle and pulled the door open. The staircase was narrow, carved from wood so old it looked silver in the candlelight. She descended, the steps creaking beneath her feet like old bones waking up from a long nap. At the bottom was a room smaller than she expected, round, stone-walled, and silent. Except, not quite. There was a gentle hum, like music too old to be heard with ears. In the center of the room sat a chair, and in it, Elliot. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady, and beside him stood another clock. But this one was unlike any she had ever seen. It had no hands, no face, just a swirling pattern of stars that shifted slowly with each breath he took. Clara didn't speak. She simply walked closer and sat beside him. After a few moments, Elliot opened his eyes. "You found the waiting room," he said, not surprised, not alarmed, just calm, as always. "What is this place?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "This is where I come when time needs me to listen. Some people keep time by moving forward. I keep it by being still." Clara looked at the star clock beside him. "It's not broken?" "No," Elliot said. "It listens. It holds all the moments no one else remembers. Grief, joy, first steps, last hugs, the forgotten hours as your book now shows you." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she saw in his gaze not just the weight of age, but the kindness of someone who had given his life to holding things others had dropped. Clara sat with him in silence for a while, listening not with her ears, but with something deeper, the way you listen when your soul finally stops hurrying. And in that stillness, she felt it, her mother's laugh in the ticking of her clock upstairs, her own childhood in the soft hush of the room, and something new, a purpose as quiet as a whisper beginning to bloom. The following morning arrived with a sky the color of old parchment and a breeze that smelled of damp earth and moss. The rain had eased into a misty drizzle, barely brushing the leaves and cobblestones as if nature itself was exhaling slowly. Clara awoke in the attic guest room, but she didn't rush to rise. She lay there for a while, hand resting on the now ever-steady bluebird clock, and listened to the hushed rhythm of the house. Every board, every clock, every drop of mist on the glass seemed to breathe together. There was a gentleness here that soothed even the sharpest memories. She finally slipped from the bed and made her way down to the kitchen, where Elliot was, of course, already preparing 2 steaming mugs of what he called sunrise tea, though the sky outside hadn't shown a trace of sun yet. He said nothing when she entered. He didn't need to. They shared a nod, a sip, and the soft silence of people who understand each other. After breakfast, Elliot surprised her. He handed her a small iron garden spade and gestured toward the back door. "There's something you should see," he said. Clara followed him into the garden, now slick with rain and glowing faintly in the mist. The path curved slightly toward a crooked arbor draped in flowering vines, and beyond that, tucked beneath an old oak tree, sat a forgotten sundial, half swallowed by ivy and time. Beside it, half buried in the soil, was a clock, a large circular face set in a moss-covered stone base like a fountain without water. "I made this with someone," Elliot said, brushing away dirt and leaves. "Long ago. She believed memories belonged in the soil as much as in stories, so we built this, the garden clock. It chimes not by hour, but by feeling. It listens to hearts, not minutes." Clara knelt beside it, running her hand along the stone. The metal was cool, but beneath her touch, a warmth pulsed like a heartbeat awakening. And then, to her astonishment, the clock made a sound. It wasn't a chime in the usual sense, not sharp loud, but a gentle ripple like wind passing through wind chimes made of glass and river water. It vibrated through the soles of her feet, up her spine, and settled behind her eyes like a memory trying to come home. Elliot smiled softly. "It remembers you. Or maybe it remembers what you brought back." Clara stood, slightly breathless, and asked, "What does it mean?" Elliot looked toward the mist. "It means something is ready to bloom, not in the garden, in you." That afternoon, Clara sat near the sundial, eyes closed, listening to the garden clock's soft pulse, and thought about everything that had led her here. Her mother's silence, her journey in the rain, the bluebird clock, and the forgotten room of frozen time. It was all connected, woven like vines, wrapped around her heart until it could beat fully again. And so she stayed there, letting the rain kiss her hair and the earth hold her feet, until evening painted the skies in soft blue grays and the garden clock gave one final ripple, a lullaby of memory and promise. By the next morning, the mist had lifted, and the village beyond the garden hills stirred with the slow rhythm of market wagons and early footsteps on cobblestone. The clouds remained, but they were lighter now, less like burdens and more like soft blankets folded across the sky. Clara sat by the window, the bluebird clock gently ticking beside her, when a knock sounded at the front door. It was the kind of knock that didn't ask permission. It simply announced that the next chapter had arrived. Elliot opened the door and stepped aside without a word, letting in a tall woman wrapped in a green shawl her eyes kind and searching. She looked at Clara for only a moment before smiling the way someone does when they recognize something they'd forgotten they'd lost. "You're the girl from the stories," she said gently. "We weren't sure you were real." The woman's name was Maeve, and she came from the village below, the same village Clara had passed through without stopping on the day of her arrival, too lost in her own silence to see its soul. Maeve explained that for years the villagers had whispered about the clockmaker's cottage. Some said it was enchanted, others said it had vanished entirely. But everyone agreed on one thing. People who were lost often found their way there, and they never came back quite the same. Clara listened quietly, her fingers curled around the bluebird clock, the ticking like a second heart in her hands. "There's a festival tonight," Maeve continued, "something your mother used to love. She danced every year beneath the willow tree in the square, always with a wild flower tucked behind her ear." Clara's breath caught. She remembered that, not clearly, but like a story someone else had told her once. It had lived in the corners of her memory, folded away until now. Elliot, who had remained quiet, finally stepped forward and placed a small, wrapped bundle in Clara's hands. Inside was a pocket watch, not ticking yet, but carefully crafted, with a golden dial and tiny blue flowers etched into the face. "Your mother started this," he said softly. "She asked me to finish it. I waited until I knew the time was right." Clara looked down at the watch. Her reflection warped the curve of the glass. She didn't cry, not this time. Instead, she simply nodded as if everything had clicked into place. That evening, she walked down the winding path to the village, the pocket watch tucked in her coat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her steps were steady, not rushed, not lost, just steady. The town square was alive with candlelight and laughter. Lanterns swayed on strings overhead. Music floated in the air like warm bread from a kitchen window. And beneath the willow tree, Clara stood very still. The villagers gave her space. No one asked her to speak. And then, without quite knowing why, she took the bluebird clock from her satchel, placed it at the tree's roots, and whispered, "Thank you." The chime that followed was soft, like wind through leaves, but it reached every corner of the square. The dancing paused for only a moment, long enough for everyone to look up and smile. Clara stayed until the stars came out, holding both clocks close, and in her chest, her heartbeat and time finally moved together. Not rushed, not delayed, just right. The stars shimmered above the village that night, like they too had paused to listen. Clara lingered beneath the willow long after the festival had faded into laughter and farewells, the soft music of fiddles and feet trailing into the night like smoke. The bluebird clock, resting quietly at the tree's base, ticked not just with time now, but with memory, and the pocket watch Elliot had given her remained unopened in her palm, its golden surface warm despite the cool breeze. She didn't feel alone, not anymore, but she did feel something else rising, an awareness, quiet and slow, like dawn creeping in before anyone has noticed. Something had shifted. The clocks were no longer just tools. They had become something sacred, a part of her, a language of remembering. When she returned to the cottage at the edge of dawn, Elliot was waiting by the door as if he'd known she'd come back at exactly that hour. He didn't ask questions, only stepped aside and motioned her in. But this time, Clara didn't go to the hearth or her room or the ticking hallway of memory. She walked to the tall grandfather clock by the entry, the one with the hidden staircase, and placed her hand on the door. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked softly. Elliot nodded. "There always is." And without another word, she descended once more into the stillness of the waiting room. This time, the room felt different. The star clock beside Elliot's chair pulsed with a deeper light, like a galaxy breathing in sleep. He gestured for her to sit across from him. When she did, he placed a third object between them, a key, not like the one she used before, but older, carved from pale stone, etched with patterns that looked like moonlight and music. "This one doesn't open a room," Elliot said, his voice more tired than usual. "It opens a path." Clara's brow furrowed. "To where?" Elliot's eyes didn't meet hers at first. "To wherever you choose to take the time you've gathered." She stared at the key, then at the clocks in her arms. "You're saying I leave?" Elliot gave her a sad smile. "Or stay. The house will ask, but never demand." Clara didn't answer right away. She sat in silence, listening, not to the clocks, not to Elliot, but to herself. And for the first time, the answer wasn't clouded with doubt or grief. It came slowly, but clearly, like the ticking of a long-stilled clock beginning again. She would stay, just for now, not because she was hiding, but because the cottage had given her something time could never steal: stillness, purpose, roots. She would learn more, help others, maybe even repair clocks of her own one day. Elliot reached out and placed the stone key in her palm. "When you're ready," he said, "the world will wait." And that night, as she lit the last candle in the window and the rain returned in soft murmurs, Clara curled beneath the patchwork quilt once more, not because she was weary, but because she knew morning would bring a new rhythm, and she would be ready to meet it, one heartbeat at a time. The rain had a different tone that morning, not sorrowful or sleepy, but purposeful, like soft fingers tapping gently on the rooftop to rouse the house. Clara woke before the light fully settled into the sky, the familiar ticking of the bluebird clock steady at her side. Downstairs, Elliot was gone, his chair by the fire empty, but still warm. The cottage, however, didn't feel empty. It felt full of breath, of time, of something stirring gently just outside her knowing. She moved through the house slowly, her fingertips grazing polished wood and worn spines of old books. And then she saw it. A small envelope tucked beneath the sundial clock in the hallway. It bore no name, only a wax seal in the shape of a crescent moon. Inside was a note written in a hand she knew before she even read it. Her mother's. "To my Clara, if this finds you, then you've returned to where time remembers. I once brought you here as a baby when I was lost and needed to remember joy. Elliot helped me. This house helped me. And now I know it's helping you. You carry more of me than you think. My laugh, my love, my stubborn heart. Follow the ticking, my darling. You'll know where it leads." Clara's knees went soft as she folded the letter slowly, holding it to her chest as tears spilled, not of pain, but of recognition. This wasn't just her story. It was her mother's, too, and maybe her grandmother's before that. A story passed not in books, but in clocks, in hands, in laughter that lingers like the scent of lavender. Outside, a soft chime rang from the garden clock. Clara followed it barefoot across wet stones, her eyes lifting to the willow tree swaying gently in the breeze. There, standing with his back to her, was a man. He was soaked, his coat clinging to him, but he didn't move. In his hand, he held a locket. Her father, she hadn't seen him in years, not since he drifted away in the fog of his own grief. Something, maybe the clocks, maybe the story, had led him back. He turned, eyes uncertain, but the moment he saw her, something cracked open in him. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. She stepped forward and placed the bluebird clock in his hands, and it began to chime, just once, like a heartbeat waking up. Later, they sat beneath the tree together, the locket open between them, her mother's smile glinting up at the rainy sky. Elliot watched from the window of the cottage, a cup of tea in his hands and a knowing peace in his heart. He had done what clockmakers do best, not fix, but guide. And now, Clara would carry that rhythm forward. So now, little one, let your own clock rest for the night. Let the rain sing you soft. Let the story settle deep in your dreams. Because time, in the right hands, doesn't just pass. It heals